aren't you afraid that we just fall asleep? No. It does? Okay. No, stay. Keep on. Is it working? Yeah. Will we start? I suppose. So we will start. So first of all, thank you for all of you for being here. Yeah, one colleague of mine told me that maybe it was the worst session ever to just have a symposium because it was just after the conference dinner. And maybe it's true, but maybe it's also the best session because we have the most motivated participants. So thank you for being here for this symposium. And the symposium today is entitled Academic Wellbeing in Higher Education, Lessons Learned from Teachers and Students. And I am Michael de Clercq from the Université Catholique de Louvain in the French-speaking part of Belgium. And I will present with Lisa Kins, which is just right there, and Raven Renas, which is just next to Lisa. And our discussant, Robert, will just discuss the three presentations of us. And so what is the point for this symposium today? The ideas, and the main idea was that the COVID-19 pandemic was like a magnifying glass to just put the problems that were already there in higher education, and among these problems, the problem of academic well-being. For example, more precisely, the fact that we have to close the higher education institution really threaten the academic well-being of students, but also of the teachers. And so the purpose of this symposium today is to think about that and to connect the question of academic well-being from the perspective of the students and the perspective of the teachers. And we will try to propose this kind of holistic reflection about academic well-being in higher education, connecting those two publics, okay? And to do so, finally, I will present first. I was thinking that I present at the end, but okay. I will present first by connecting the two, so by investigating teaching practices and the role of teaching practices on student well-being. Then Raven will talk a little bit more about teachers' well-being during the COVID. And finally, Lisa will talk a little bit more and deeper about the students' well-being and the psychological needs and the university learning environment. So I hope this would just suit your expectations, and Robert will try to connect everything just to connect this presentation to the main goal of the symposium. Okay? As a chair, I will also be the timekeeper, but I won't be the timekeeper for myself, so I try to not make it too long. Okay? And so I will just start with my presentation. Okay, so hello again, I'm Michael de Clercq, still from Belgium. And yeah, today I will present you a little bit more one of my last studies, which is entitled Instructional Practices and Third-Year Students' Emotion in the Transition to Higher Education, an investigation during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we will talk during around 15 minutes about the question of the role of teaching practices on academic well-being of the students during this pandemic. But before just entering precisely in the subject, it's important to know that in Belgium, the transition from secondary to higher education is quite challenging, and we have a lot of students who fail and a lot of students who drop out the first year at the university, which means that we have around this 40% of students that really succeed at the end of the year. And it's challenging because we have an open access system, and we can discuss about it a little bit further after the presentation. But we have also, the transition is also characterized by an important number of challenges. So that's quite challenging. But for the students in the last 2 years, that was even more challenging because there was this transition, but also the COVID-19 pandemic, and so the online learning and so on. And it really exacerbated the well-being concerns about the students. And so this is important to really have a focus on this period, the first year at the university, this transition. And there is a lot of research about that, but less research about the impact of teaching practices. But so what do we know about teaching practices for the moment when we are looking at the studies about that? We can't just take the perspective of active learning and teaching literature, and we can see that global designs such as problem-based learning and flipped classroom and so on can have a positive effect on engagement and achievement of the students, but we don't know so much about the role of this design on teaching, on well-being. And these designs are very global, and so it's very complicated from this literature to have a precise expectation of which teaching practices will have a specific effect on well-being. So it's not enough. We also have some research from the course experience questionnaires that show an impact, for example, some impact on well-being from the workload or maybe to good teaching, but it's using subjective self-report measure of the student, of the perception of the student. So is it really actually measuring the concrete actual teaching practices? We are not sure, and maybe we need to go a bit further. And third, we also have some new research about observation protocol, very objective of teaching practices, but it's very the beginning, and they are not talking about well-being, and they are not really based on a strong theoretical model. So here we can say that there is a lack in the literature to have a very specific approach of teaching practices and to just be able to know which teaching practices will have a positive effect or not on students' well-being, and especially during the COVID. And based on this statement, we went a little bit further and we tried to build a theoretical model based on the literature in secondary education, which is a literature that has two main strengths. The first one is that they are really strongly theoretically based, and that's great. And the second one is that they're really empirically based. And so there is a lot of validation about all the construct and dimension, and we try to adapt it from secondary to higher education context. Okay? And I won't go in every dimension very precisely because I don't have time, but we can discuss it about a little bit further after. But in our models, we have four main dimensions of teaching practices. The first one is social-emotional support, which are all the teaching practices that really emphasize on providing a good climate for the students, very considering for it, having positive feedback, and so on. We also have the classroom organization, and that's all the teaching practices that really focused on managing the productivity of the lesson, of the time, but also the participation and the attention of the student during this time. So a time that is really productive, but also with students really attentive and really engaged in the course. Moreover, we have two other dimensions: instructional support, which is there. Oh, I ran out of battery. So sad. Instructional support, which are all the teaching practices that really emphasize on the understanding of the students and that really focused on making all students understand the lesson and so. And finally, cognitive activation, which are all the teaching practices that really emphasize on deep understanding, deep learning, self-regulation. And we were based on these four dimensions to investigate the role of teaching practices. And more precisely, we have three research questions. The first one is, what is the role of instructional practices on student well-being? The second one is, which dimension precisely have an impact? And finally, how do instructional practices could have an effect on students' well-being? And to answer both the what and the how, we made a mixed study with quantitative results, but also with qualitative results. And that's the reason why my presentation would be a bit dense. Okay, so concerning the quantitative approach of our results, we made a study based on 932 students from 12 different courses. And we measure, of course, instructional practices and teaching practices, but also instructional features, so the characteristics of the course, and the individual variables that are really important when you are talking about the transition. So the background variables, but also the psychosocial variables, so self-efficacy beliefs and so on. And our measure, dependent measure of well-being was a global scale combining positive and reversed negative emotions. And to analyze that, we used multi-level analysis. I won't go deeper in the method, but it just allowed to consider both the individual perspective, but also the classroom global climate, okay? And we consider both together. And we make different models, hierarchical models, introducing the different categories of variable. So the background variable, then the instructional features, then the instructional practices, and finally the psychosocial variables. So it was very progressive. And I will just show you the result now. So in multi-level analysis, we start with a model with nothing, a null model, to estimate the role of the context on the question. And here, this model shows that we have around 60% of well-being that can be explained by the course, so by the environment, teaching environment. That's quite interesting and quite a lot. Then I introduce first the background variables. They have no much impact. The only impact is past performance on well-being, or a small impact. After we have introduced the instructional feature, the characteristics of the course, and there we have a surprising results that seniority could have a negative impact during the COVID on academic well-being. We could discuss it a little bit after. But we have also a positive impact of teaching format, which means that the more the lecture or the lesson is active and giving a great place to students in the learning and teaching, the best the well-being will be for the student. But that was not the most important. The most important was to, because it doesn't explain so much, but the most important was to introduce the instructional practices. And here we can see that you have 1A and 1B, consideration for student perspective and teacher proximity, as the main predictor of academic well-being of the student. And so it's the two dimensions of socio-emotional support, okay? But we can also see that instructional support, so the way, all the teaching practices that just promote the understanding, but cognitive activation also have positive impact, okay? And that could explain a little bit more of what is happening in the course and what is the effect of the course. And finally, we have introduced psychosocial variables that have a main effect on academic well-being. And that also changed a little bit what was significant for the teaching practices. And so when you are considering for psychosocial variable, you can see that instructional practices and cognitive activation just disappeared, but it's production and discipline that just appeared as having a negative effect on academic well-being. And that was a bit strange, but we can discuss it a bit after. So, but socio-emotional support was still there and still strong. Okay. So that can answer to what and which dimension have an impact on academic well-being. But the other question was also, how is it working and how is it impacting on student academic well-being? So to do so, we made 7 focus groups with the same subsample of students, so the same students, but 1 year after, this year, and we asked them for the retrospective looks about the COVID-19 and how they lived that and how the teacher could be a support or not for their well-being. And what we can see is that 5 major themes were identified beyond instructional consideration, rethinking the way of teaching, dealing with students' difficulties, and the interaction at the centrum of the lesson. Okay? And the first themes was beyond instructional consideration, and there was a very strong agreement between the student about that. The teacher would take a sizable time to care about this, to ask them about how they feel, and the teachers would care about students' feeling has, of course, a really good impact on their well-being. That was really helping for them to take a lot of time during the course to just ask if they were okay and if everything was okay with the COVID. That's not surprising, but that's quite interesting to see it. The other one that is not surprising either, actually, but it's the rethinking the way of teaching. And so the students told us that a major threat for them, for their well-being, was the teacher that just doesn't adjust their courses when they just switch to online teaching. And that was really complicated for them to just follow, and it was very, very difficult and very threatening for their well-being because they were really anxious about that. And they told us that what really matters when they are this modification was a modification about time management, reducing the workload, but also really emphasizing on the entertaining of the lesson, making the quality of the video, eloquence, and so on. The third themes, with also strong agreement, was the dealing with the student difficulties. And here is teacher's consideration for the students, but not for their feelings, but for their difficulties in understanding. And so here the students told us that real support was this notion of having planified moment to regulate the rhythm of the lesson, to ask if the student really understand, and to take the time to explain and re-explain. And it was really important for them, for the well-being, and also for their involvement. And finally, the interaction at the center of the lesson. A large part of the students told us that what really important for their well-being was the possibility to have a lot of interaction online and to have small groups, stimulated interaction, and proposing debate during the courses. But what was interesting is that there is a medium agreement here, because some students told us, I totally disagree. Actually, it was stressful for me to have a course with interaction, and when there is all this interaction online, I don't really like it. And I just want to skip this course. I avoid to go to these lessons. That could be interesting, and maybe something, there is something to analyze a bit deeper here. Okay, so that was the main results. I know that was a little bit dense, but I will just take a message for you. So maybe the first one is that instructional practices did have an impact on student well-being, and in our context, it's around 16%. So that's not so, that's kind of a lot. And when you are talking about that, it's mainly explained by the first one, the consideration for student perspective and teacher proximity. Yeah. And that really drew is the need for relatedness that Lisa, I stole your picture. That Lisa will talk about a little bit later. But there is also this surprising impact of productivity and discipline. And maybe you can explain that from the qualitative analysis. Maybe the the teacher that really focused on the productivity of the learning task won't take so much time to just ask the student about how they feel and how is it just going with the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, we have this kind of complicated effect of cognitive activation. Is it important or not? What we can see is that maybe it's instructional practices that really matters with the differential support. Is the teachers really aware of the different difficulties and take consideration for the different difficulties of the student in the understanding? So my last slides with 3 limitations and maybe future questions. The first one is that here we have one scale that is not very convincing when we are talking about well-being. It's just one large scale with positive and negative emotion together. That's not the best way to measure it. And we could go for further investigation with other scales, for example, MBR. The second one is not a limitation, but more a question. What about the generalization of the findings here? Are the findings really specific, the finding would be specific to the COVID-19 pandemic, or is there a global effect for the students in other contexts? So we definitely need a replication here for the study. And finally, a more broader question, but are the impacts of teaching practices really isolated? Because we have divided that in different teaching practices, but maybe it could be also interesting to see the combination of this teaching practice in a learning environment, and maybe to go through this kind of teaching approaches with a lot of different teaching practices together. And we could do that with profile analysis, for example. Okay, so that's all from me. Thank you for listening. And of course, if you have any question for the moment, of course, don't hesitate to let me know. We could have 1-2 minutes for clarification question. Thank you. So do you have any question for me for the moment? Yeah. Socioeconomical status. Yeah. It's a yeah. Yeah. So socioeconomic status here was a composite variable, and it was composed of the diploma from the mother and the father, together with, I can say that, all the cultural activities that they make, but also all the possession of the home. So if they have, I don't know, several TVs or a lot of possession like this. Yeah. So it's really a composite of these 3 dimensions: cultural activities, diploma of the parents, and the possession. So it's socio-economical and cultural status maybe, but yeah. Yeah. Another question? No? Okay. Thank you. I will let the floor to Raven, I think. Yeah. So Raven, the floor is yours.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, then I think we can get started directly. So my name's Raven, as introduced in the beginning, and together with my colleagues Melissa Usoy and also Martin Daumiller and Marcus Drezel from University of Augsburg, we wanted to kind of take a different approach to Michael. So instead of looking at student well-being during the COVID-19 pandemic, we focused on university teacher well-being throughout the pandemic, and specifically we wanted to get some more nuanced insights into factors that might be contributing to their well-being throughout the pandemic by taking a qualitative perspective. So to start off, why university teachers? Why did we want to focus on this population in particular? I think some of us might be university teachers here today, so we know that this population is a really core asset to all higher education institutions. They take on a lot of different roles, such as teaching and mentoring their students, conducting research, obtaining funding, contributing to their communities, scientific communities, the public, and disseminating scientific research findings. So the list is kind of endless here. And this has important implications for society and also for education, particularly for students. So we know that teachers can help have a big impact on students in terms of their learning and their academic success, but also their engagement, motivation, their self-efficacy, and what they might want to do later on in life. So it's clear that university teachers are important. This we knew. And given their important role, we need to identify some ways to make sure that they can perform in the best way possible and succeed in their role. And one important factor here is making sure that they are able to maintain and have high levels of well-being. So research shows that affective and cognitive aspects of subjective well-being have been linked to job and teaching satisfaction in the university teacher population. Also, perceived success, use of professional development opportunities, and improved student-teacher relationships. And in the general well-being literature, we know that it's connected to physical health and longevity, work performance, work creativity, income, and social relationships. So from this, we can kind of deduce that in order for teachers to perform well, it's beneficial to help them foster their well-being and make sure that they're feeling well to work productively, but most importantly to be happy and engaged in their role. But research shows that there's some variation in university teacher well-being. So while some might thrive in their role, we also see that others have been found to struggle. So many research papers cite this as stemming from shifts in the higher education landscape altogether. So throughout the past decades, we've seen internationalization, massification, commercialization within the higher education sector, and this produces greater demands for excellence and quality and productivity for university teachers. And as a result, different psychological and physical health challenges might arise that put their well-being at risk. And the research has shown that university teachers or university faculty struggle with issues like burnout, stress, having a lack of work-life balance, mental health concerns, and this has also been found on a comparative level. So studies have found that, the work of university faculty is comparable in terms of stress levels as healthcare professionals or school teacher populations. And this also seems to persist on an international level. So not only, Germany or Canada, the USA, Netherlands, there's really studies all over. And we can expect that given the challenges that arose from the COVID-19 pandemic, that if some university teachers were already struggling with their well-being prior to the pandemic, that given the changes that were brought forth, like transitioning very abruptly to online teaching, potentially having a higher workload as a result, limited childcare opportunities, general uncertainties surrounding the pandemic that all of us dealt with, or health concerns like actually contracting the pandemic. These issues, as Mikael said in the beginning, might really magnify kind of existing issues, and it's something that we wanted to get a better insight into and really see what university teachers themselves had to say about their experiences during COVID-19 in terms of their well-being. So we wanted to ask the questions, what insights can we gain from how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted university teachers' well-being from their own perspectives, and this was a German sample of university teachers, and also how can we use this information moving forward also beyond the pandemic. So we had a sample of 226 university teachers from Germany. That was 109 women in the sample, mean age of 45 years. 88 were full professors, 43 were without PhD, and these university teachers came from a range of different disciplines, so natural sciences, social sciences, arts and humanities, and so on. And the participants, they were asked to complete an online survey. So this was actually part of a larger quantitative study that we conducted, where we also had an open-ended field where the university teachers could elaborate on the question, how has COVID-19 negatively impacted your personal well-being? In terms of how we analyze this qualitative data, we used a program called Atlas TI, and we used a content analysis approach. So this is a research method for the subjective interpretation of the content of qualitative data through systematic classification, process of coding, and identifying themes and patterns. So we basically went through the data, got familiar with it, and then coded each sentence with keywords, and then grouped this into sub-themes and overarching themes. We also had a random sample of 25% of the data coded from 2 trained research assistants to resolve disagreements and to refine the coding throughout the process. And in terms of what we found, so we identified 7 overarching themes. Health, broader concerns about the pandemic, home office, online teaching, work challenges that were non-teaching related, perceived support, and positive effects of the pandemic. And we'll go through each of those in detail now. So for each theme, I just have the sub-themes laid out and an example quote from each sub-theme. So for health, teachers mentioned a lot about their emotions and feelings. For example, one university teacher mentioned feeling loneliness or having melancholic mood swings. They also mentioned social isolation being a big component of their well-being or negatively influencing their well-being, so really missing that social contact. Restricted leisure activities, so feeling unwell about missing going places, and also physical health challenges. One teacher reported that due to the online work, they're forced to spend many hours sitting, which manifests itself in pain in their body. So during the regular teaching time before the pandemic, many teachers were standing in front of their courses and getting more movement in, so this seemed to be a challenge as well that was mentioned. In terms of broader pandemic-related concerns, university teachers mentioned at times struggling with COVID-19 measures, such as wearing the masks, general COVID-19 related concerns, such as having uncertainties or being worried about vulnerable populations during the pandemic, but not necessarily their immediate group, and also being worried about the people in their inner circle, their loved ones, but feeling stressed that their loved ones might be impacted by the pandemic. They also mentioned quite some aspects concerning the home office situation. So many university teachers with childcare obligations mentioned that this was a challenging context for them to maintain their workload while at the same time needing to take care of their children at home who couldn't be in the daycare centers, having general distractions, so needing to work in home office with a partner or family members and not being able to concentrate, having poor physical conditions of the home office, such as not being equipped with proper materials like an ergonomic chair or a desk, and technical problems, internet connection problems, and not having the proper programs that are necessary on their devices at home. Okay, so some of these aspects were quite general. We could say, I think that many of us experienced them, but we also came across some interesting themes that were kind of more specific for faculty teaching, university teachers in particular. So regarding the online teaching, and I think this connects with Mikael's results as well, they mentioned struggling with a lack of contact with students and really missing personal interaction with them in the classroom. They perceived a decrease, some of them, in their own teaching quality, a misfit between their subject and the online context, so kind of feeling that their subject was not able to be well taught in an online context, especially if there were practical components that they would usually teach in person. And also feeling reduced meaningfulness of their teaching practices in general in the online context, that they found it to be less enjoyable or not as fun. Then we have non-teaching related work concerns, such as an increased workload, an inability to disconnect from work, lack of contact with colleagues, and reduced vigor. I think the inability to disconnect from work might be particularly relevant for this population. And yes, then we have perceived support. So university teachers at times perceived that they were not as well supported as they would have liked to have been from their institution or department or supervisors in terms of equipping them with the equipment that they needed in their home office to transition to this context, but also in terms of organizational support, that the communicative and organizational processes were not always so clear. And as we know, there were many changes throughout the COVID-19 pandemic ongoing. So yeah, I think this contributed to some level of impact of being uncertain about the current circumstances and not having that support. And lastly, interestingly, we have positive effects of the pandemic. So as I'm sure you all noticed, the question that we asked was formatted in a negative way. So I think it's especially interesting that despite the negative formulation of the question, there were still numerous university teachers mentioning some positive effects of different ramifications of the COVID-19 pandemic. So some mentioned enjoying the increased autonomy, appreciating the freedom that they've gained, not having to get up so early, more time at home, working in the garden, more time by not having to commute to the workplace, and also a general preference for home office for some people. So finding home office to actually be less distracting than their regular university work context. So that was it for our analysis. And in terms of a little bit of a discussion and some key takeaway messages, so I think the findings are really interesting in terms of gathering some more nuanced insights into university teachers' well-being. There are some quantitative studies that are kind of popping up over time regarding how university faculty handled the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's also interesting to hear from the university teachers themselves about how they experienced this. And I think the qualitative approach is especially fitting in this novel context that we have with the COVID-19 pandemic. We also see maybe some tips or hints for why there's variation in university teacher well-being throughout the pandemic, what kind of factors might be causing this. But we also have some limitations, so we did not explicitly ask the participants about the positive effects of the pandemic, so we might really be seeing an underrepresentation of findings in that regard. This was cross-sectional, so more extensive longitudinal research would be needed, and also quantitative research to kind of take these findings forward. And yeah, also generalizations are not possible. And we might have seen some sort of response bias, given that maybe the university teachers who were kind of functioning the best might have been the ones who were positioned well to complete this survey in the first place. And yeah, in terms of future research or future directions, I think that university teachers, we can see from these findings, they face numerous challenges and some positive effects, some negative effects, but we see definitely that there are differences in their responses, and maybe some groups are being particularly affected in this context. So we really saw in the data that those with childcare responsibilities seem to have a hard time with teaching and their role during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in terms of more specific university teacher implications that maybe are not so common to all of us, the online teaching seemed to be particularly an issue, and also disconnecting from work. And for next steps, we think it would be interesting to supplement this with further quantitative research to understand the prevalence of these struggles or challenges and kind of more generalizable findings. But yeah, practice-wise, as a general take-home message, I think it's very important for departments and policymakers to acknowledge that these kind of issues might be existing and try to ask and focus in on how university teachers can be supported in unique, uncertain contexts, but also, as we know, a lot of these problems persist with or without the COVID-19 pandemic. So, focusing on transferring these findings to post-pandemic conditions and how we can really support this population. Yes, and that would be everything. So I would be happy to answer any clarification questions or thoughts that you might have, if we have time. Okay. We have a few.
So, do you have any questions for Rita?
Yes.
You would be director of your department of teachers.
Mm-hmm.
What will you do based on your results for your teachers?
Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think one important thing could be just discussing the difficulties of the COVID-19 pandemic context and the implications that it can have for, if I'm talking about my direct employees, let's say, asking how they feel, what they need, providing them with structured guidelines on how things will proceed throughout the pandemic so that they have less uncertainty in how their role should function, and also making sure that they have access to adequate resources. For example, the childcare issue, which was quite prominent, I think most universities have some form of childcare services. So really making the people in your department aware of what's out there to support them, and also doing your best to support them, I think would be the most important thing in terms of direct. Yeah.
You can tell these to your boss.
Yes.
And one more, now after COVID, because it's quietly getting out of our jobs,
Mm-hmm.
hopefully.
Yeah.
How can you analyze these challenges for well-being, but in a regular
Mm.
teaching and university responsibilities day or year?
Mm-hmm.
And how can you mix it a little bit with what you do? I mean, do you think it's a good idea to take these themes and sub-themes, but after applying in a non-COVID context, and try to make a more quantitative question?
Mm-hmm. So, what really comes to mind when you ask this question, for me at least, is this online teaching context, because I think because of the pandemic, we obviously all shifted very strongly to online teaching, and I think that this was difficult, but in a way it moved things forward, because this is something that was kind of already being done. Like, we had online teaching before the pandemic, but definitely not to this level. And I think that it's something that will stay to an extent in our lives past the pandemic. I think there will be more use of online teaching, and I think from the pandemic we really saw that teachers need to be better taught about how to teach in online contexts. It's impacting their well-being, it seems, to some extent, and as we saw from Michael's results, this seems to have important implications also for the students, and wider consequences. So I think that could be something that could be really focused on and taken away from pandemic times and transferred into post-pandemic times. And in terms of whether all of these findings can be generalized, like into a quantitative context past the pandemic, I think some of them clearly not. But other ones, like the ones that may have already had some kind of impact prior to the pandemic, we can see, these are very important, and any kind of hiccup that disrupts our context can really emphasize these even more. So, sure.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Raven.
switch to my presentation. Okay, then, hi, my name is Lisa, and I will now draw back from the X course or teacher well-being back to student well-being. And there are a couple of things that, echo what Raven and Mika have found, so it's actually quite interesting. And this is my current study at the moment on student well-being in terms of COVID-19 and the impact of basic psychological needs within the learning environment for student well-being. As you might have also recognized in your own teaching that students are particularly affected by the pandemic. They're a particularly vulnerable population. And there are specific, they have been before as well. There's research showing that also outside of the pandemic time, students are quite at risk for well-being. And with the pandemic-related stressors that were stated already in the beginning of the pandemic, it shows that students might be more vulnerable to these stressors because, for example, there's uncertainty in the pandemic. Like, who of us has experienced uncertainty throughout the pandemic? Because I, for example, have. Yes. Or disruption of social lives. And yes. And when you're a student in a very uncertain context because you just left, 18 to 20 years being at home, first time on your own, it's quite an uncertain context in itself, and you have to socially readjust anyway, and you have financial insecurities anyway. So these are all stresses that come with the pandemic, but they are, might affect students even more because those are stresses that come itself and automatically with being a student. And as we just heard, it's 16% of variance of student well-being explained by instructional and educational practices. And what we were thinking about it, that we wanted to take the basic psychological needs out of the self-determination theory, which have been linked to well-being and also educational well-being, and that they can be adjusted within the learning environment for better student well-being, and wanted to investigate how exactly they have been compromised throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and how exactly we can promote them further on, also beyond the pandemic. And just a short recap, because I don't know how anybody's familiar with these basic psychological needs, but we have, for one, autonomy, which is then having self-control, flexibility within your studies, which might draw back actually to, you said that the three main instructional practices, they kind of align with those, because it's the student perspective, like taking the student perspective into account. So it's giving them control and autonomy over their education. And secondly, it's competence. So giving them the means to actually reach the aim that they were striving for, which might relate to the discipline, productivity, what Mika found in his study. And lastly, relatedness, so social belonging, but also interpersonal connectedness, which is, again, in the teacher-student relationship, teacher proximity. So it's quite funny, actually, that you found exactly these, like, in my opinion, they kind of align quite nicely with the three basic psychological needs. And so we were wondering, first of all, how exactly student well-being has been affected and what the impact of the learning environment was for student well-being, with the sub-hypothesis of that basic psychological need satisfaction relates to higher student well-being and need frustration to lower student well-being. And beyond that, we asked them how they experienced the interaction with teachers and students, so also diving into the relatedness aspect. And last of all, and I guess those are the results that are most suitable for the beyond pandemic context, how they, what they would want to take away also for their new educational normal. For this, we used a mixed method approach with a survey with quantitative but also open-ended questions. And a total of 653 students participated, and they were largely 4 different faculties, so the sample, we had quite a variety within our sample in any case from our university. And to give it some context, okay, see that you cannot read it properly, but I will show it, because COVID is quite a context and time-specific time, because every country treats the measures differently and every university treats it differently. So I wanted to put it into context, and you see here this is 2021, it's 1 year into the pandemic, and our data collection was between April and June. And that was in the Netherlands, when here, more or less, the higher education institutions, they opened it again, the restrictions were loosened, and at the same time there's one fine line that you unfortunately cannot see, I guess, which says that at that time they also started with the vaccinations. So it was a context that, where a bit more security came back actually to students, and they were again able to go back to university. As measures, we included for well-being the World Health Organization 5, the WHO 5 measure, which measures general well-being and mental health, and the PANAS, again with the positive and negative effect. For the basic psychological needs, we use the basic psychological needs satisfaction and frustration scale. And at the end, open questions, just as I said, like interaction, how was the interaction with your teachers, with your fellow students, and what are your ideas for a new educational normal? And regarding the impact of the basic psychological needs on well-being, we analyzed the data with multiple regression to see their predictive, to assess their predictive strength. And for the open-ended questions, we used content analysis to see which themes were reoccurrent and how often exactly they were stated. And first of all, I wanted to ask you what your estimate is, like what would be the percentage of students that rated their well-being lower? I don't know if you have any idea of the percentage, what you could think of. Lower than before?
No, in the question.
No, it generally low. Like the WHO 5 has a cutoff of this is good well-being, this is poor well-being. So generally the percentage of the poor well-being. Over 50? And you're correct. Like what we found, at least in our, and you won. You get a car. Exactly. So what we found, at least in our sample, is that 70% of students rated their well-being low. And when you compare that to pre-COVID times, this is enormously higher than usually. So that was one of the findings where we're like, okay, this has to, I don't know, be a topic also post-pandemic, I guess. And in terms of the predictive strength of the basic psychological needs, as I said, we calculated multiple regression, and we have two models. So one model simply having the socio-demographics, and one model then additionally entering the basic psychological needs to see what exactly their added value is. And first of all, what you see at the lowest column is that we actually, the variance of the expected variance of well-being went from 6%, more or less, in the model 1 to around 50 with entering the basic psychological needs. So we can assume that they have quite an impact. Exactly, and these are our model 2 results. So first of all, for the general well-being and mental health, we found all of the basic psychological needs predicting well-being, except of relatedness frustration. So this was this was the only predictor that was not significant. And interestingly, for positive effect, we found more the satisfaction scales to predict well-being, to predict positive effect. And for negative effect, we found the frustration scales. That was something that I thought was quite interesting, that it's like when you frustrate needs, it leads to more negative emotions, but it doesn't necessarily lead to less positive emotions, which is something that I thought was quite interesting. And as well, quite interesting is that throughout the whole model's relatedness was the predictor that was then non-significant or one of the weakest predictors, whilst competence was one of the strongest. So this was something that we didn't expect, to be honest. Regarding the qualitative results, first of all, the interaction with teachers, they stated positive as well as negative adjectives when they described the interactions, such as they were really distant. It was solely content related. Interaction was restricted, but at the same time, they also were talking about supportive teachers and that this really helped them throughout the time. And that their efforts, like the impact that teachers made, really helped them like when they really saw that they were putting effort into, putting time into teaching. And lastly, a sense of belonging, that when a teacher actually interacted with them, it made them felt seen, because otherwise they felt completely disconnected and not seen by their teachers. For the interaction with students, we have something quite similar, so also negative and positive aspects, or recurring themes actually with, yeah, it's distance, it's solely content related, we only talk about university, the chit chat is gone. But also, yeah, I felt supported, which related also to common humanity, like the feeling of we're all in this together. That was one of the positive things that they stated. And particularly in the learning environment, they stated that group assignments helped them. So really small scale learning that helped them to connect with students. Exactly. And in terms of getting to know people, they were saying that was quite difficult to get to know people, but the university could actually enhance that. So they were talking about opportunities that the university offered for them to connect with their fellow students, but also the opportunities that they themselves created when the university wasn't. And in terms of higher quality and lower quantity, students stated that they had fewer friends, but the bonds with them were deeper. And what was also quite interesting in this regard was that they differentiate between maintaining relationships and establishing relationships. That they said it was actually okay to maintain the friendships that they've already had pre-pandemic, but it was nearly impossible to establish new ones. And lastly, to the light is really, you don't really see the bubbles, to the new education normal. First of all, they were commenting on if they want to go back to the old normal or want on-site teaching, or maybe this better, should have made it more visible. Okay, great. Or how the preference was from on-site teaching over hybrid teaching to online teaching. And most of the students actually wanted hybrid, but if you connect the back to old normal, which is also on-site teaching and on-site teaching, the students had a really preference for on-site teaching. But they also stated a lot of advantages for hybrid teaching. This was something that they wanted to take along, like the flexibility and autonomy that also the teachers stated, which they got by with asynchronous teaching, that it gave them the opportunity to connect it to their side jobs and family course and stuff like this. And at the same time, for a new educational normal, they were also stressing the social cohesion aspect, that they wanted the university to focus more on the social cohesion. And a couple actually also talked about the academic culture, so that they wanted to get away from the university being a factory producing numbers, but more towards a more person-centered approach again. Yeah, as a discussion, as I said, the quantitative and qualitative results are a bit contradictory in terms of relatedness. Like quantitatively, we saw that it's one of the weakest links, but qualitatively, they were talking a lot about this, and we were thinking about how this could be. And it might be that this scales when they ask, like, does it help you when within your learning environment you connect with your students, that they might say no, because they simply don't connect. And like this, the questions might not fit a disconnected context, and that there are issues with measuring this. Or at the other hand, university focuses really on producing autonomous, competent human beings, but relatedness might be a secondary aim for university as an institution. But we might also have overestimated the qualitative results, because we explicitly asked them to rate the interaction and to comment on the interaction. And as practical implications of future research, it's definitely the hybrid teaching, going into flipped classrooms and everything, like the positive experiences they made, the asynchronous teaching, giving them flexibility, and as I said, also the focus on social cohesion at university. These were like the reoccurring themes that they thought were really important. And the limitations are quite similar to the ones before, it's really context and time specific. This is the Netherlands 1 year into the pandemic. 1 month later could have been different. And it's also cross-sectional, so the predictive strength is only in the sense of statistical predictive strength and not of actual predictive strength. And also, as Mikhail said, well-being is a really broad concept, reaching from physical well-being over emotional, mental, to social well-being, and we only measured emotional and general well-being with the mental health scale, so it's only one part. So as take-home message, students have been affected. I don't think that this is any news for you, but might be news for you that basic psychological needs are quite important in this, and that it's worth investing in them. And that we found first directions for post-pandemic educational new normal. Yeah, thanks. All right, and if you have any questions, feel free. Yay.
Do you know any studies between, like, similar with what we did, but pre-pandemic times? The relation between the basic psychological needs and
Yeah.
well-being?
That link has been found before, actually, quantitatively and qualitatively, as far as I don't know.
What about the relatedness in those studies?
There's actually, as far as I remember, I don't know at the top of my head, I'm not 100%, but that it was important. That it's, yeah, we expected it to become even more important actually now, and the contrary happened, at least quantitatively, which was a bit weird. But pre-pandemic times, relatedness was also one of the important factors. But I don't know how the ratings are there, like if competence also there is more important than relatedness. I can tell you that we did an intervention study as well, and we measured that as well. And that was now post-pandemic times, so that was this spring when, yeah, in the Netherlands, all restriction fell and everything was back to normal. And there, it's again that competence frustration is the strongest predictor. That's across all scales, which, yeah, I didn't expect that, but apparently. Yeah. All right, yeah.
That's not a question, maybe it's just a reflection of the results. I'm not so surprised that the competence is stronger one, because it's always some, it's just like
Yeah.
it's like basics, or I think it's kind of the basic fundamental needs, and
Yeah.
that can build also in the ratings also. Maybe it seems to have this massive, very strong effect everywhere.
Yeah.
Achievement, and maybe it's
Yeah.
it could be also because of the nature of its needs that
Yeah.
could be,
I mean, really, also nature of university, it's about competence, it's conveying knowledge, and if you fail, that's like the strongest, I guess, well-being impactor there is. Yeah. Yeah, that's, yeah, definitely.
Another question? No, never? Okay.
Otherwise, we go to the discussing. References.
Thinking of maybe sitting, because you're all sitting, and it's the first time that I make a presentation with you or talk about something while sitting down. First, thank you to the three presenters and to this wonderful presentations. And actually, you make my job very easy because you already drew a lot of relations between the studies, and I don't even know what I have to do now and what I can do because there's not so much to say, not so much left. So what I want to do is just maybe highlight some things that came to my mind when both reading the presentations before, the papers before, and also now when listening to this. And of course, I don't want to annoy you with more presentations, because this is really supposed to be interactive. So please have questions and interact. As we just heard, that interaction is important. I just drew here copy-pasted this from the symposium description. So the goals of the symposium are these two, basically, and then the more overarching one, resolving educational problems emerging through the pandemic. And I will come back to this in 2-3 minutes, if and to what extent actually the symposium or the presentations actually fulfilled these goals, because this is what the official goal description at least was. We heard about a variety of participants and also research contexts now. We heard presentations about university students, about university teachers. The three colleagues used different concepts about well-being. So there was talk about well-being, for instance, with this WHO scale. Then there was talk about emotions, and also there was variety in methods. So considering the second general objective or goal here, so consider various theoretical frameworks, stakeholder perspective, mixed methods approach. This actually, you could say that was really fulfilled, because there is a variety in these studies that we just listened to, where we're just being confronted with. Let me go a little bit more into detail and offer just some highlights, as I said, about the specific presentations. And let's start maybe with Lisa, because she was the final presentation here. I think really some achievements that you really did in your study was actually this theory-based link between motivation based on self-determination theory and well-being. So this is really, even though maybe this might have been done before, but I think this is really, really valuable in our field of research, where maybe well-being is maybe considered something like a standalone concept, and maybe then we have relations. But what actually causes well-being, right? I mean, so I think this is really an achievement, really positive aspect here. I didn't want to call it positive, but it's like a, praise, even though we know that praise is not so effective sometimes. So this is really something that I like about it. And also, of course, I like the mixed methods approach, because this can really show, as we saw here about the discussion between the need for relatedness and the qualitative aspect. This is really, really helpful, and this is really, really important. So really, really congratulations on this. If there's praise, then there's also some kind of criticism, of course. So I think that these two things here might be a bit critical, and you mentioned some of them already. You mentioned the first, or you've already started discussing the first aspect. So is this specific for a pandemic situation, or is it general? And you already answered to that. And then I had one more theory-based question, maybe, that we can also discuss later. I was thinking, as far as I understand, self-determination theory is actually less the individual contribution of each individual basic psychological need, but actually the interaction of all three needs that should be relevant for motivation, especially intrinsic motivation, as we know. So I was thinking, with your quantitative method, could you actually compute or assess or analyze the interaction of the three needs, or maybe of two needs, and then find out maybe for the need for relatedness, maybe then there's a relevance of the need for relatedness still, even though there's maybe no main effect, So this could be something that could be interesting to maybe have a further look in addition to other aspects, of course. And then for future research, I was thinking also about this, as you mentioned this, as I said, I mean, you make it very easy for me. The need satisfaction versus frustration on the same dimension. So is it really on the same dimension? I mean, is it really the opposite, so to speak? Or is it actually something else? And there is older theoretical thoughts on need frustration versus, or I think they call it hygiene factors, and fulfillers. So there is some theoretical, maybe older theories that maybe could be used to look at the differential effects of a need satisfaction versus frustration. Thank you, Lisa, for this presentation. Some highlights on Ravens, the second study that we just heard. I have to say the first thing here, the achievement. I mean, having a sample with more than 200 participants and an in-depth analysis of qualitative data, and with content analysis, even though it was just, as I understood now, you only analyzed 25% of the data, but still it's really an achievement. I mean, it's really, really valuable and really, really a thing to be proud of, I could say. to do this. And then also you mentioned also that even there were positive aspects mentioned, and you mentioned this as a limitation of the study. I would say it's an achievement, because even though you only ask explicitly and directly for negative well-being aspects or emotions, some of your responses actually mention positive aspects, and I think this is a strength of the findings, at least. Because this means that there is something going on, and the teacher that you ask is relevant, so there's something going on. Then to be maybe a bit more critical, yeah, you write on one slide, I think you write something about unique insights, and then also I would agree with some of you, maybe that there would be quantitative, there could be a quantitative analysis, could be maybe relevant to have this, say, underlying implicit comparative approach. If you say that this is unique, then how can you say that it's unique compared to who, compared to what, compared to which situation? And then another aspect is that I thought, because if I understood it right, it was really an inductive analysis that you employed. And I thought, we have so much theory and ideas about well-being and emotions and everything. Could it be interesting maybe to also employ a deductive or partially deductive approach to this? Not just to make it easier for the analysis of 200 n equals 200 sample, but also to really advance and connect it to the quantitative results that we have, both on student emotions and also on teacher emotions already. So this could be maybe ideas. And another idea, yeah, this is exactly the idea, quantitative, and then you also mentioned this longitudinal follow-up. So again, you make it very easy for me to discuss this and to think about this. Finally, or firstly, however you want to say, we have Michael's presentation here, and I think that what you just presented to us is actually, I mean, maybe it's an exaggeration, but it could be kind of myth-busting, because the analysis between students and between courses, or within courses and between courses, I think this is really, really, really important to tell our colleagues and to spread this information and to disseminate that it actually matters how we instruct, how we teach. So it matters for students, and it matters even following your quantitative results. It matters even more how we teach than maybe who the students are and their individual differences. So I think this is really an achievement, and again, the mixed methods approach, how you just presented it, is, I think, or in my personal opinion, is really an achievement again. You can be critical about everything, and here I was thinking about your conceptualization of well-being as emotions, and I think you also mentioned this in your limitations. So what about life satisfaction? What about a model that maybe includes or defines well-being as emotions plus life satisfaction? So where is this element? And then also I was thinking, this is not on the slide here, about this aspect that I think, if I got it right, you combine positive and negative emotions also on one scale, right? And I was also thinking about this, so I would be a bit more critical to say that less positive emotions kind of equals or is on the same dimension as more negative emotions. So this would be a differentiation, maybe interesting for discussion or for future research. And then, of course, following my conviction that the within students' perspective is also very relevant, of course, I was missing this a little bit. Yeah, and for future research, since you have such a broad perspective and such an inclusive approach already, it could be really interesting, especially for your presentation, but this also applies to the other two, to have a look on the interaction between student and teacher's perspective, actually. Because, and this is a general a comment that I also will make on the next slide, that this could be something, and maybe it's in direction for future research, to look how teachers' perspectives and teachers' well-being and students' well-being actually interact, or which kind of interaction there is. And of course, theoretically speaking, there could be a lot. And I think yesterday in one presentation, or I'm not sure, we heard a little bit about this. So I think this is one way to go. Symposium takeaway, coming back to the general objectives or goals, I would say that consider academic well-being as a holistic concept. I'm not so sure if we reach this goal actually here, because we have, as I said, very different conceptualizations of well-being. And did you really establish it as a holistic, as a unifying holistic grand concept so far? I think maybe there's more work to do with this, but definitely I would say that we reached and we fulfilled, or you fulfilled the idea to consider various theoretical frameworks, stakeholder perspectives, and the mixed methods approach. So really, congratulations to that, to all three of you. And 2 more comments. Future research, as I just mentioned, connect student-teacher perspectives can be one way to go. Connect research on student and teacher well-being and emotions to maybe more basic research on motivation and emotion. And some of you did this, for instance, with the self-determination theory, but there are many other concepts and also methods maybe even from emotion and motivation research. So are we limited, so to say, to questionnaires, surveys, and interviews, or open-ended questions in questionnaires? I think we are not, and we should think maybe a bit more out of the box with that regard. And then we also already started this, what does this mean for development? What does this mean for practice? And I think then one way to go is to talk about, I agree with you in that, and also to maybe establish a new, maybe balance between the challenges and the well-being. So I agree with all of you that the pandemic has made well-being more relevant and more like a magnifying glass. I think this is what you said in the beginning. And I think that this is really important to follow up and to keep on working on this and talking on this, but then also, of course, to try to let actions speak. Thank you, and I'm very happy to discuss further with all of you. And I think with this, the floor is open, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if you have any reaction or any question to open the debates, or maybe looking to Lisa and Rhythm to have any reaction for don't hesitate.
Yes.
Yeah, go.
Just one comment, thank you. I was thinking a bit in a similar line when I thought about Lisa's results about the difference between establishing and maintaining relationships when the students, or when there maybe is a difference in your data. And I thought that this could also be interesting for interpreting, for instance, your quantitative results for the, for this, I don't know what you call it again, but relation or relatedness or.
Oh, yeah.
So to maybe such an approach could maybe help differentiating and maybe clarifying.
Yeah, that's true. And I think in your presentation, Lisa, but also in mine, you have this kind of clue that it could be interesting to just not look only at the global effect, but maybe at the differentiated effect. For example, in the qualitative analysis, I have this disagreement about the interaction, for example. That means that we clearly have these two groups of students, these groups that will need this interaction and the small group one, and the other group that just doesn't want it. And so that's interesting because when you are looking at a global effect on a quantitative analysis, you cannot just grab it. So maybe it needs to go a little bit into a profile analysis. And I think it's the same for you because in my last research, I did this kind of profiles with standard determination theory, and that's interesting to see that when you have the three needs that are really satisfied or frustrated, or if you have just one specific needs, it doesn't really have the same impact on what are your strengths, weaknesses, and how you can support that. So yeah, that's a good suggestion, and I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I also can imagine that that's quite interesting to look at, especially in profile analysis. And I thought that yesterday as well, because there was one session where with a presentation also on student well-being, and there they found mediating effects between their preferences for learning environment, like that when they prefer digital, asynchronous or synchronous, their well-being was, like some well-being outcomes were positively impacted by the learning, I don't remember, but at least those were mediating effects of whether you prefer digital or face-to-face, and when you prefer face-to-face, you're dissatisfied with what is happening at the moment, and that might also go in that direction, like finding mediators that differentiate between the effects.
And maybe another comment about this question is, I think it's not only a question of a diversity of students, but it's also a question about when will you measure the perception of the students, because we are working on a follow-up study, and we are realizing that the perspective for the COVID now it's much more different than the perspective one year ago, because at the beginning some students find it quite comfortable and quite good and quite positive, but on the long run they are really starting to just get exhausted with that. And so I think we won't have the same answer if we just made the same studies today talking about the COVID, because there was all this 1.5 years of COVID really exhausting, and at the beginning it could be nice in some way, and after it was getting worse and worse. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, maybe adding to this, because we implemented an interview study throughout the first pandemic month. And also in this study, there were more open questions, and there was also what are the positive insights and the negative insights that you take away now 1 year into the pandemic. And as you also said, there were lots of positive insights as well, especially like personal growth or more time for myself, more time for hobbies. Actually also finding a better balance. There's also worse balance, but there's also better balance, so that you have more mindfulness and everything. So there's also potential in what we went through, and then trying to take the positive aspects away into afterwards.
Yeah, I think you also see it in the teacher context, like with the autonomy being something that can be beneficial for some teachers, and not to completely erase this experience and regress back to how it was pre-pandemic times is important, I think.
Yeah.
very interesting to see. Thank you. It's very interesting to see this idea that it's either or, right? Or because, as you say, maybe it's both, and maybe also methodologically, you really have to look actually at the interaction between who is the student and who and what is the instruction in the specific course. Yeah.
Your presentation, because there was that we connected that teaching practices, and this is something that we need to do in Helsinki as well in the future. Somehow to capture the students also at the same time they answering questions about study related turnout, but also the teaching practices. Yeah. Thank you.
And also something that we wrote about as well, that teacher well-being also relates to student well-being, that there's an interaction, like when teachers are feeling well, they are better teachers and providing the learning environment that make their students also feel better. So it's a lot of interactions there, and with background variables, with interaction variables, with systemic variables that all play a role in that regard.
The reaction or the question? Just one more. No? Okay. I think it's time. Yeah.
Oui.
Perfect.
Okay.
So thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention for all
Thank you for being here.
And thank you for being here in the morning. So yeah. You're welcome.
Thank you.
And have a nice last day of the conference. I think it's closing at the midday.
At 4.